Hey everybody, here we go with the Count of Monte Cristo, chapter 36, Toxicology. The Count of Monte Cristo had arrived at Madame de Villefort's door, and the mere mention of his name had set the whole house in confusion. Madame de Villefort was in the salon when Count was announced, and immediately sent for her son to come and renew his thanks to the Count. Edward had heard of nothing but this great personage for the last 2 days, and hastened to obey the summons, not through obedience to his mother, nor yet because he wanted to thank the Count, but from sheer curiosity, and in the hope that he might fire off one of his saucy jokes, which always elicited from his mother the remark, "The bad boy! But I must really overlook it, he is so clever." After the first formalities were exchanged, the Count inquired after Monsieur de Villefort. "My husband is dining with the Chancellor," replied Madame de Villefort. "He has only just left, and I am sure he will greatly regret that he has been deprived of the pleasure of seeing you." "Where is your sister Valentine?" said Madame de Villefort, turning toward Edward. "Send someone for her, so that I may introduce her to the Count." "You have also a daughter, madame?" asked the Count. "She must be quite a young child." "It is the Monsieur de Villefort's daughter by his first marriage, and a pretty well-grown girl she is, too." "But melancholy," interrupted Edward, who, wishing to have a plume for his hat, was pulling feathers out of the tail of a parrot that screeched with pain. Madame de Villefort merely said, "Be quiet, Edward. This young madcap is quite right, nevertheless, and is only repeating what he has, unfortunately, often heard me say. In spite of all we do to distract her, Mademoiselle Villefort is of a melancholy and taciturn disposition, which often mars her beauty. Why is she not coming, Edward? Go and see what is keeping her so long." "They are looking for her where she is not to be found." "Where are they looking for her?" "In Grandpa Noirtier's room." "Where is she, then? If you know, tell me." "She is under the large chestnut tree," continued the mischievous boy, as, notwithstanding his mother's expostulations, he presented live flies to the parrot, who appeared to relish them. Madame de Villefort stretched out her hand to ring for the maid to tell her where Valentine was to be found, when the girl herself entered. She certainly looked sad, and on closer inspection the traces of tears were to be seen in her eyes. She was a tall, slim girl of 19, with bright chestnut hair and deep blue eyes. Her whole deportment was languid, but stamped with the elegance which had characterized her mother. Her white and slender hands, her pearly neck and blushing cheek, gave her at first sight the aspect of one of those beautiful English women who have been rather poetically compared to swans admiring themselves. On seeing beside her mother the stranger of whom she had already heard so much, she curtsied with such grace that the Count was more struck with her than ever. He stood up at once. "My stepdaughter, Mademoiselle de Villefort," said Madame de Villefort. "And the Count of Monte Cristo, King of China, Emperor of Cochin China," said the young imp, casting a sly look at his sister. "Have I not had the honor of seeing both you and Mademoiselle somewhere?" asked the Count, looking first at Madame de Villefort and then at Valentine. "It occurred to me just now that I had, and when I saw Mademoiselle enter, her face seemed to throw some light on the confused remembrance, if you will excuse the remark." "It is hardly likely, Count. Mademoiselle de Villefort does not like society, and we rarely go out." "It is not in society that I have met you, mademoiselle, and the charming little rogue. I shall remember in a moment. Stay." Excuse me. Sorry, that went down the wrong tube. The Count put his hand to his forehead as though to concentrate his thoughts. "No, it was abroad. It was... I do not quite know where, but it seems to me that this recollection is connected with a beautiful, sunny sky and some religious feast. Mademoiselle had some flowers in her hand, and the boy was chasing a peacock, while you, madame, were under a vine arbor. Help me out, madame. Does nothing I have told you bring back anything to your mind?" "No, nothing," replied Madame de Villefort, "and it seems to me, Count, that if I had met you anywhere, I could not have forgotten you." "Perhaps the Count saw us in Italy," said Valentine timidly. "That, indeed, is possible," said Monte Cristo. "Have you traveled in Italy, mademoiselle?" "My stepmother and I went there 2 years ago. The doctor feared for my chest and prescribed Naples air for me. We stayed in Bologna, Perugia, and Rome." "You are right, mademoiselle," exclaimed Monte Cristo, as though this simple indication had sufficed to freshen his memory. It was at Pergia, on the feast of Corpus Christi, in a garden of the Hôtel de la Poste, that we chanced to meet you, Madame, Mademoiselle, the boy, and myself. Yes, I remember having had the pleasure of seeing you there. I remember Pergia perfectly, also the Hôtel de la Poste and the feast you mentioned, said Madame de Villefort. But though I have taxed my memory, I am ashamed to say I do not recollect having seen you. Strangely enough, I do not recollect it either, remarked Valentine, raising her beautiful eyes to the Count. I remember, said Edward. I will assist you, Madame, resumed the Count. It was a baking hot day. You were waiting for your carriage, which had been delayed in consequence of the feast day celebrations. Mademoiselle went down to the garden while your son was chasing the bird. You stayed in the arbor. Do you not remember sitting on a stone bench there, talking for a long time with someone? It is true, said the lady, turning a deep red. I recollect now. I was conversing with a gentleman in a long woolen mantle. I believe he was a doctor. Exactly so. I was that man. I had been staying at that hotel for the past fortnight and had cured my valet of a fever and my host of the jaundice, so that I was looked upon as a great doctor. We talked for a long time on different topics. I do not recollect all the details of our conversation, but I do remember that, sharing the general erroneous opinion about me, you consulted me about your daughter's health. At this moment, the clock struck 6. It is 6 o'clock, said Madame de Villefort, obviously agitated. Will you go and see whether your grandfather is ready for his dinner, Valentine? Valentine rose, and bowing to the Count, left the room without saying a word. Was it on my account that you sent Mademoiselle Valentine away? Asked the Count when Valentine had gone. Not at all, was the quick reply. It is the hour when we give Monsieur de Notier the miserable repast which supports his wretched existence. You are aware, Monsieur, of the deplorable condition of Monsieur de Villefort's father? Yes, Madame, he is paralyzed, I think. He is, alas. The poor man has lost all power of movement. His mind alone is active in his poor human machine, and even that is weak and flickering like a lamp waiting to be extinguished. Excuse me for worrying you with our domestic troubles. I interrupted you when you were telling me that you are a skillful doctor. I did not say that, madam, replied the Count with a smile. Quite the contrary. I have studied chemistry because, having decided to live chiefly in the East, I wish to follow the example of King Mithridates. Mithridates Rex Ponticus, said the young scamp, cutting up some illustrations in a magnificent album. That was the one who breakfasted every morning off a cup of poison with cream. Edward, you naughty child, Madame de Villefort cried out, snatching the mutilated book from her son's hands. You are unbearable and only make yourself a nuisance. Leave us and go along to your sister in your grandfather's room. The album, said Edward. What do you mean? I want that album. Why have you cut up the drawings? Because it amused me. Leave us. Go. I shan't go until you give me the album, said the child, setting himself down in a big armchair, true to his habit of never yielding. Here it is. Now leave us in peace, said Madame Villefort. She gave Edward the book, and he went out. Allow me to observe, Madame, said the Count good-naturedly, that you are very severe with your mischievous child. It is sometimes necessary, replied Madame de Villefort with all the firmness of a mother. He was reciting his Cornelius Nepos when he spoke of King Mithridates, said the Count, and you interrupted a quotation which proves that his tutor has not lost time with him. In fact, that your son is advanced for his age. The fact is, Count, replied the mother, pleasantly flattered, that he is very quick, and can learn all he wants to. He has only one fault. He is very self-willed. But do you really think Mithridates took such precautions and that they were efficacious? I believe it so firmly that I myself have taken these precautions so as not to be poisoned at Naples, Palermo, and Smyrna, as that is to say, in the 3 cases when, without these precautions, I should have lost my life. Did you find this means successful? Perfectly. It is true. I recollect that you told me something about it in Perugia. Really? Said the Count with well-feigned surprise. I do not remember. I asked you whether poisons acted with the same force with northerners as with southerners, and you informed me that the cold lymphatic temperament of the northerners did not offer the same aptitude as the rich and energetic nature of the southerners. It is true, said Monte Cristo. I have seen Russians devour vegetable substances without being the least indisposed, which would have infallibly killed a Neapolitan or an Arab. Then do you think the result would be more certain with us than in the East, and that in the midst of our fog and rain, a man would become more easily accustomed to this progressive absorption of poison than he would do in a warm climate? Certainly. It must be understood, however, that he would only become immune from the particular poison to which he had accustomed himself. I quite understand that, but tell me, how would you accustom yourself, or rather, how did you accustom yourself? It is quite easy. Supposing you knew beforehand what poison was going to be administered to you, supposing this poison were brucaine, for instance. Brucaine is extracted from the Brucia ferruginea, is it not? Inquired Madame de Villefort. Just so. Well then, supposing the poison were brucaine, resumed the Count, and that you took 1 milligram the first day, 2 milligrams the second day, and so on progressively, well, at the end of 10 days, you would have taken a centigram. At the end of 20 days, by increasing this by another milligram, you would have taken another 3 centigrams. That is to say, a dose you would absorb without suffering inconvenience, but which would be extremely dangerous for any other person who had not taken the same precautions as yourself. Well then, at the end of a month, you would have killed the person who drank the water out of the same carafe of yourself. Yet, except for the slight indigestion, you would have no other indication that there was poisonous substance mixed with the water. Do you not know of any other antidote? I do not. Madame de Villefort sat pensive. After a short silence, she said, It is very fortunate that such substances can only be prepared by chemists, otherwise one half of the world would be poisoning the other. By chemists, or those who dabble in chemistry, replied Monte Cristo carelessly. And then no matter how scientifically planned a crime may be, it is still a crime, said Madame de Villefort, tearing herself from her thoughts with an effort. Though it may escape human investigation, it cannot escape the eye of God. Yes, there is consequence to grapple with, continued Madame de Villefort, in a voice broken with emotion and stifling a sigh. It is fortunate that we still have some conscience left. Otherwise we should be very unhappy, said Monte Cristo. After any vigorous action, it is conscience that saves us, for it furnishes us with 1,001 excuses of which we alone are judges. And however excellent these reasons may be to lull us to sleep, before a tribunal they would most likely avail us little in preserving our lives. Take, for instance, Lady Macbeth. She found an excellent servant in her conscience, for she wanted a throne not for her husband, but for her son. Maternal love is a great virtue and such a powerful motive that it excuses much. But for her conscience, Lady Macbeth would have been very unhappy after Duncan's death. Do you know, Count, that you are a terrible reasoner, said Madame de Villefort after a moment's silence, and that you view the world through very dark spectacles. Is it by regarding humanity through amblex and retorts that you have formed your opinion? You are right, you are a great chemist, and the elixir you administered to my son which brought him back to life so rapidly. Oh, Madame, said Monte Cristo, 1 drop of the elixir sufficed to call the dying child back to life, but 3 drops would have forced the blood to his lungs in such a manner as to produce palpitations of the heart. 6 would have arrested respiration and caused much more serious syncope. 10 would have killed him. You may remember, Madame, how eagerly I snatched from him the phials that he so imprudently touched. Is it such a terrible poison, then? Good gracious, no! First of all, let us admit that the word poison does not exist, since poisons are used in medicines and, according to the manner in which they are administered, become health-giving remedies. What is your elixir, then? A scientific preparation of my friend, the Abbé Monte, who taught me the use of it. It must be an excellent antispasmodic, observed Madame de Villefort. A perfect one, Madame. You saw for yourself. I frequently make use of it with all possible prudence. Of course, he added with a laugh. I should think so, replied Madame de Villefort in the same tone. As for me, who am so nervous and prone to fainting, I need a Dr. Monte to invent for me some means of breathing freely to relieve me of my fear that I shall suffocate one of these days. In the meantime, as it is difficult to obtain it in France, and as your Abbé will not feel inclined to make a journey to Paris on my account, I must content myself with Monsieur Planchet's antispasmodics. But I have the pleasure of offering it to you, said Monte Cristo, rising. Oh, Count, only remember one thing. In small doses it is a remedy, in large doses it is a poison. 1 drop will restore life, as you have witnessed. 5 or 6 will inevitably kill, and all the more terribly at that, even when diluted in a glass of wine. It in no way changes the flavor, but I will say no more, Madame. It is almost as if I were advising you. The clock struck 6:30, and a friend of Madame de Villefort's, who was dining with her, was announced. If I had the pleasure of seeing you for the 3rd or 4th time, Count, instead of the 2nd, if I had the honor of being your friend instead of simply having the pleasure of being under an obligation to you, I should insist on keeping you for dinner, and I should not let myself be daunted by a first refusal. 1,000 thanks, Madame, replied Monte Cristo, but I have an engagement which I cannot avoid. I have promised to take to the opera a Grecian princess of my acquaintance, who has never yet seen grand opera and is relying on me to escort her. I will not detain you then, but do not forego my recipe. Most assuredly not, Madame, for that would mean forgetting the hour's conversation I have just had with you, and that would be impossible. Monte Cristo bowed and went out. Madame de Villefort remained standing, wrapped in thought. He is a strange man, said she, and I could almost believe his baptismal name is Monte. As for Monte Cristo, the results had far surpassed all expectations. Here is fruitful soil, he said to himself as he went away. I'm convinced that the seed I have sown has not fallen on barren ground. Next morning, faithful to his promise, he sent the prescription to Madame de Villefort had requested. All right, that's 36. Let's see what happens next.